Now, last week we started talking about prophetic sign acts. We kind of introduced it a little bit, and this is important for not only understanding prophets in general, but definitely the book of Hosea. And for the sake of the 12, Hosea opens up with prophetic sign acts. So we talked about that, and this was the big idea. Hosea, and by extension his wife and children, embody the message of Yahweh to Israel for the consequences of their apostasy. And that's what sign acts are. It's somebody embodying a particular message. They're going to act it out, they're going to live it out, they're going to take it upon themselves. And whether the kids or the wife want to or not, they are sign acts for God's message here. And although they are, what we're going to get in chapter 1, negative sign acts, by chapter 3, really by the end of chapter 1, but definitely by chapter 3, it flips the sign acts upside down, and all the negative representation is undone and given positive connotations here. So they're sign acts, and they can be good or bad. So there's all of that stuff that we talked about last week. I want to read the chapter 1, and I think the first verse of chapter 2 again. And then we're going to dive into putting this in context. And next week we'll start talking about the sign act of Jezreel. So the word of the Lord came to Hosea, son of Beeri, during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and during the reign of Jeroboam the second, son of Jehoash, king of Israel. And we'll start with this today. When the Lord began to speak through Hosea, the Lord said to him, "Go marry a promiscuous woman and have children with her, for like an adulterous wife, this land is guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord." We'll talk about that translation and talk about what this means. Verse 3, so the narrative continues. He went and married Gomer, son of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. Then the Lord said to Hosea, "Call him Jezreel, because I will soon punish the house of Jehu for the massacre at Jezreel. And I will put an end to the kingdom of Israel. In that day I will break Israel's bow in the valley of Jezreel." Gomer conceived again and gave birth to a daughter. And the Lord said to Hosea, "Call her Lo-ruhamah," which means not loved or unloved. "For I will no longer show love to Israel, that I should at all forgive them. Yet I will show love to Judah, and I will save them, not by bow, sword, or battle, or by horse or horseman, but I, the Lord their Elohim, will save them." After she had weaned Lo-ruhamah, Gomer had another son. The Lord said, "Call him Lo-ami," which means not my people, for you are not my people. I am not your God, or I am not your I am. Yet the Israelites will be like the sand on the seashore, which cannot be measured or counted. In the place where it was said to them, "You are not my people," they will be called children of the living God. The people of Judah and the people of Israel will come together. They will appoint one leader and will come up out of the land. For great will be the day of Jezreel. Say to your brothers, "My people," and your sisters, "My loved ones." So last week, after defining sign acts, Batman, for the corruption of the people, the main part of the passage opens up. The Lord began to speak through Hosea. Let's just get this off the screen here. So most books open up differently than Hosea. Verse 1 summarizes that Yahweh is speaking to Hosea, but here it says he's speaking through Hosea. And there's a deliberate difference here between verse 1 and verse 2, and between just how Hosea opens up with these sign acts as opposed to other messages. And what I want to mention about this is that there's just a public message delivered to others is usually what prophetic messages are about. Here, this opens up with a private conversation of instruction to Hosea. But nevertheless, that private conversation is going to lead to public change and public attention-grabbing actions. It's going to cause people on the outside to look at Hosea and say, "Wow, you're really devoted to Yahweh. Why are you marrying a woman like this?" Because, of course, nobody can keep their reputation for being a promiscuous woman. Nobody can keep that secret. If you're a promiscuous woman, the society around you knows it. So it doesn't make much sense for God to say, "You're faithful to me, you're a good and loyal servant. Go marry somebody who's not faithful to me, who's unequally yoked," to use Paul's language commonly used from 1 Corinthians 7. Go yoke yourself to somebody you're not going to be equal with, in the sense that you're both heading the same direction in life. So it's designed to pique curiosity, but that curiosity and the explanation behind the action is going to take time to spill over from the private to the public through the birth of their children, their God-given names, all the sign acts that they're going to come to represent. So God is kicking off this message to Hosea by saying, go marry this woman. And your marriage is going to be a symbol, a sign act of the relationship to Israel between me. And as time goes on, the sign acts, of course, are going to get more specific and exact for children to children. So it's like they're going to get married. It's going to take at least 9 months for Jezreel to be born. We don't get a timetable here. We don't know how long it took these women to wean their children, what that meant. In Samuel, when it says Samuel's mother weaned him before she took him to the tabernacle to devote him to the Lord, it seems like he's like 5 or 6 years old by that point. So how many years is actually passing between all of this? We don't know. But this is setting up something that's going to be a long-term type of message, which is usually a little bit different than the other prophets.
In having Hosea marry a promiscuous woman of Gomer, are we to assume that all of these children are Hosea's, or that
we will ask that, and we will ask that question. We will see what we can glean from that today, because that's the question everybody wants to ask, that's fine. Yeah. But in the ancient world, look, up until even 100 years ago, back-to-back pregnancies was the norm, not the exception. So, and we just don't know. So what I want to mention about this private message to Hosea that spills over into public is the fact that there's no real such thing as a merely private conversation with God. Eventually, everything always affects the public, which in turn affects your private life in this ongoing symbiotic relationship. We tend to be a radically individualized type of culture, something the ancient world could not really understand. And so when God has a private message with, or a private conversation with a prophet, it's always for the sake of going and delivering it publicly. Even now, when he says, go take this action, there's no such thing as a private marriage. Your marriage and your intimacy in your marriage is between you and your spouse. But of course, it always spills over into the public because marriage produces new image bearers, and those new image bearers exist in the public. A marriage is the smallest, most fundamental public relationship that exists. Multiple marriages come together and you're forming a society, and those societies come together, and you're building society on marriage as you build your family. So this radical idea of our modern culture that you can just be a private person with your private lives is not entirely true. The private always affects the public always affects the private. And I think this private conversation between Hosea and God is a good example of bringing that out. Nobody has merely a private relationship with God divorced from the public relationship with the rest of God's people. In our radically individualized culture, a lot of people think, well, I don't need to go to church to have a relationship with God. Yes, but you need to go to church to have a relationship with God's people. And you and God are not the only two beings in existence. Get your butt in there and actually get involved and form relationships, or I'll smack you. Okay. I've been going over this with people since like high school when I first became a Christian, and we're sitting in like English class one day, and my friend's like, I don't need to go to church. I believe in the Lord. Do you not get why God is actually calling communities, not individuals? He only has to call individuals and have conversations with them to go get the community to actually start acting a particular way. So personal does not mean private. Sure, you have a personal way that you can relate to God. You have personal ways that you and God can connect, and that's great. I'm not disparaging any of it, but it doesn't mean that you and God are so private that nobody and nothing ever comes into play here. The Bible does not understand or accept that idea ever. That is a misunderstanding of a personal relationship. Personal does not mean private. Anything that you learn, anything you do, anything you become, good or bad, eventually affects the people around us, which is part of the reason why God calls us to be so focused on our conduct, our behavior, and our holiness so that we can affect the people around us in good ways. Yes, Jeff.
For Genesis 21:8, children generally were weaned 2 to 3 years.
2 to 3. Can you read that verse? What does it say?
Well, it doesn't get into that. That comes in lower. So the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the same day that Isaac was weaned. In my subnotes, which is John MacArthur, he goes that children were generally weaned in the 2nd or 3rd year.
Okay, so 2 to 3 years generally appears to be the rule. Maybe Samuel, because they knew they were dropping them off at the temple or the tabernacle. Maybe they took longer to prepare him or something, and they called it weaning. Who knows? Who knows? I don't. So if there's an answer, I'm not aware of it. But thank you for drawing that out. So 2 to 3 years on average per child. But again, back-to-back pregnancies was the rule. So you could be in the middle of trying to wean one child while you're pregnant with the rest, or have another newborn that you have to deal with, and that was just the burden of motherhood. Happy Mother's Day, you know.
Yeah.
But because you also had large families, you had older kids that could actually help you with the work and make that. So not this one. It helps you with the work that needs to be done in your home, in your farm, so that the mother is free to focus on the child. That's the purpose in part of large families in the ancient world, not just the fact that they didn't really have contraceptives to stop it. So all of this I'm saying is you need to invest well in private behavior to build the public good. And this is like what Jesus is talking about in places like the Sermon on the Mount. Doing things in private, doing things in secret, not to be seen by men, but to build your own character there so that you're not a hypocrite when you do it in public. God sees in private, God is with you in the private, so go get privately with God. And then when you're publicly with people and you're all coming together, the community is even stronger because of this. That's kind of, and that's why the thesis of the Sermon on the Mount is you have to have a righteousness beyond that of the scribes and Pharisees. The scribes and Pharisees have terrible character, but they look good because they don't do anything in private. They do everything to be seen by people in public. Don't do that. Let your private lives, to the extent that they are private, be mindful of the Lord, investing in the Lord, so that it refines even further your character in the public. Whatever you learn in public, take and invest personally in private. Take what you learn on Sunday mornings, Wednesday evenings, on podcasts or anything that you're listening. Ingest it into yourself and your mind, your heart, and let it shape your character and your private wills where you're most in control, so that in public, where you don't have as much personal control or authority, you act in ways that are actually God-honoring. God's command here to Hosea seems to undercut that idea. How are you going to be a better person in private if in your most private relationship you're married to a promiscuous woman? If she's unequally yoked, if she's pulling the yoke in one way and you're trying to pull it in the other, how are you going to actually invest in God's type of life? The kind of answer to that, we don't exactly get an answer to how this works for Hosea. We get some sense when we get to chapter 3, and she's gone off and is seemingly on some level enslaved, or we might say indentured, to another man, and he has to buy her freedom back for her, and then he takes her back into his home. And he says, now we're going to act like a restored relationship here. So it's something to think about, because it's working very oddly here with Hosea. But it's meant to be not merely the private, but the public. And I like this picture because it's behind the back of one man. It's public in front of everyone. And it's just basically Hosea is kind of doting on Gomer as a godly man would on his wife. And she's just going to go behind his back, because this is what God is to Israel. I dote on you. I love you guys. I provide for your needs. And you give all the credit to Baal or some other god. So a literal translation of verse 2 might be, take yourself a wife of harlotry, because this is the word for harlotry, and children of harlotry. Take a wife of harlotry and a children of harlotry. For the land commits heinous harlotry in walking away from Yahweh. The first statement, take for yourself a wife, that's a common Semitic idiom. This is how it was described for any man to be in the process of being engaged and getting married. What's unusual is that it's tied to this idea of taking children. You didn't take children, you had children. And it's never really described as taking a wife and taking children anywhere else that I'm familiar with in the entire ancient world's literature than right here in Hosea.
Does he take the children that she's already had because she's promiscuous?
We don't know. I don't think so, because the narrative that we read is playing out so that they're married, then the children are born. I don't think that's the most likely possibility, but we'll talk about what the possibilities are here. Let me just comment on this. The English translations, they do understandably try to smooth this language out, and they change it to having children rather than taking children, because that makes more sense, even in English. Or else they ascribe harlotry to the wife alone, and they separate it out from the children being harlots. Because that's what the Hebrew is saying. Take a wife who's a harlot, and then take children that are harlot. It's calling unborn children harlots here. This is exceedingly strong, intense ideas. The tendency amongst most translators, and naturally for people who read those translations to try to interpret it, is to focus on the nature of the marriage between Hosea and Gomer, and with the emphasis being on Gomer's guilt. And this kind of goes back to your question, so we're gonna circle around here. Let me point out to you that most of chapter 1 is going to spend time talking about the children and the children's guilt, not the mother's. It's going to explain their guilt through their names and what God's going to do about it. And it doesn't really focus on Gomer all that much. She comes back into play in chapter 3, but on Mother's Day, her only role in the story is as mother to these children. And she doesn't seem to be a very good one. Well, regardless, within these text statement in verse 2, we don't yet know who the woman is, and the children aren't even born yet. So the question of who is guilty of what remains irrelevant from a strictly historical perspective. So you already asked the question, is Hosea the father? Are there other fathers? If you're going and finding a woman who's promiscuous, who's a harlot, a lot of people think, so is she a prostitute? Because this is a word that could be a prostitute. Is he marrying a prostitute? Or is he just marrying a woman who's not faithful to him? And then they start asking questions. Wait a second, if we go back and read this, and I'll put it back on the screen, verse 4 says, back up. She conceived and bore him a son. They read this and they say, him a son. That means Hosea. And so the questions become, so is Hosea the father of the first one? And is Lo-Ruhamah and Lo-Ami fathered by other people? That is a distinct possibility of which we get no real answer. I know that's not exactly satisfying, but that's the fact of the matter. Because, and this is the point that I'm trying to make. Is this the right slide? Yeah. It doesn't matter within the text what the historical events actually are. Because in the narrative of the text that we get, all that matters is that Hosea is faithful, Gomer is not, and the children are the sign acts. It doesn't matter if Hosea is the father of all three of them or not. It doesn't matter what Gomer's historical situation was when Hosea married her. It doesn't matter if she played the prostitute after the fact or what. What matters in the text is that they're not real people. They're sign acts. That's how we're to view them.
Well, I was just going to say, is it possible that that's why they say take the children? Specifically those words, because of the uncertainty of it doesn't matter what children, just they're yours now, take them. Instead of saying have children.
You know, I hadn't thought about that. I'm not sure, but I will see if I can find out. It seems to me that idea, now that you mention it, seems legitimate. Whether the children are yours or not, and whether Hosea even knows if they're his or not, they don't look anything like him. Maybe take the children. That could be a distinct possibility. I have no problem with that. As long as we think in ambiguous terms, got to put it in the right tense, and we realize we don't have answers to these questions. It's all up in the air and possible. What we do know is that Gomer, Hosea's relationship represents the Israel-God relationship. The 3 kids represent 3 specific messages to Israel. As long as we're like that, those other details don't matter. We shouldn't get too bogged down with them. But I think that's a great point that I hadn't thought about, Aaron. And if I can find an answer for you in the coming days, I will let you know.
Oh, and us too. Yeah.
No. He asked the question. He gets the answer.
This is public, not private.
Nice. Yes. But what crackpot have you been listening to?
Look and pay attention.
Dang it. So, now I get why pastors don't ever educate their flocks. They use their words against them. All right, so within the context of verse 2's phrasing, Gomer and the children are considered guilty before we even know who they are or they're even born, not because they've done anything, but because they will embody the guilt of Israel, who's walked away from Yahweh already. Speculation on whether Gomer was already an adulterous woman or even a prostitute when Hosea married her are irrelevant and can miss the point. It might even be true, but the point is Israel's guilt is guilty regardless of how or when Gomer sins or whatever these kids grow up to be. They represent the guilt of Israel. It's not really about who they are as people, even in the story.
If my mother came to me, she who is not
Yeah.
loved for the sake of my life kind of sucks.
Yeah.
And I will probably proceed accordingly.
Right.
Fair enough. Carla, were you going to ask a point or a question?
How long? We know that this was a cycle of Israel. How long from the first time they sort of walked away from God until Hosea was delivering this sign act and message?
Like from the Garden of Eden.
Well, I know.
Right, no.
I know.
A more exact dating, when the kingdom splits, around, say, 950, with the end of Solomon's reign, Rehoboam takes it up. Rehoboam's a jerk to the people. The people just ask, can we get some leniency here from what your father put on us as far as a yoke? Rehoboam's advice from his friends, not his counselors, say, yeah, you should just give them what they want. They'll obey you. His friends come up and say this euphemism for basically whip it out and show him who's boss. In English idiom, when he says my little pinky is greater than my father's whole hand, that's a euphemism for genitalia. So he's trying to say, don't mess with me. I'll be worse than my father is. And it's basically you think my father was bad. My manhood is bigger than my father's because he's an insecure little child. So he doubles down and the kingdom splits. And then Jeroboam the first is the king of Israel. And he says, I can't risk my people crossing the borders into Judah to go to the temple. They set up the golden calves. And that's roughly 750. Just to give you a ballpark, about 200 years to 750 when Hosea starts coming on the scene. So Elijah and Elijah are the 2 primary ones that have gone back like a generation or 2 before this, when the writing prophets start, and they've been trying to deal with the Baal stuff. So it's been about 200 years, and God has had prophets there before Hosea. But what you get with the writing prophets is like the last of God's mercies coming in here. And this is what you get with Jezreel. I'm going to end the nation of Israel here. It's been hundreds of years, and I've been putting up with this and trying to lead you back to me. We're not doing this anymore. That's why you're like an adulterous wife. That's why this land is guilty of unfaithfulness. So, the land is guilty of unfaithfulness or heinous harlotry. Hebrew here just a little bit, just focus on this. It's in trying to intensify the word by alliterative repetition in Hebrew. If you know that, Wang is the one who translates it heinous harlotry. He's found a way in English to actually keep the alliteration, HH sounds, that's there in Hebrew, and intensify it. You guys are bad. You guys are whoring around with other gods, and I'm not going to put up with it anymore. So how can the land be a harlot? Pop quiz, what literary device is being employed here? Go back to the prophets, the week we talked about, like 13 different prophetic devices here. It is not illusion. That's not a bad guess. Just by way of reminder, this is called synecdoche, substitutional representation. The land of Israel is shortened to merely the land. It's a personified stand-in for the people of that land. So it's not really talking about the land. The land hasn't done anything. It's the people on the land. But you can see that tight-knit connection there. We do that all the time. We talk about America, and often we're just talking about the people there, the states of Missouri or something, and we mean Missourians. So, just as Gomer and the children will be living personifications of the people's apostasy against Yahweh, the linguistic idea of the land's guilt captures the guilt of all people on the land. So it's a shorthand term here. Hosea doesn't begin with expressing the sins of the people that make them guilty. Instead, their guilt is predetermined by God without further explanation at present. So the prophet's call is merely to go be a sign act and produce more sign acts to the people and help them realize their guilt. Again, 200 years. Many prophets coming before Hosea, they're guilty, and they know it. So I like this SpongeBob meme. If you've seen this episode, Man Ray's holding up Patrick's own ID to him, and Patrick doesn't admit that he's Patrick Star with his own ID stolen. So he holds up the Ten Commandments. I'm your God. Yep. I freed you from Israel. Yes. I've done various miracles to prove to you that I'm provident and fulfill what I promised. Seems right to me. Then obey me and my commands and trust me. Proceeds to disobey the trust in the Lord. Because it's him holding his wallet and showing him this, like, so you're Patrick Star. Yep. This is your wallet and your photo. Seems right to me. It makes sense that this photo would be in the owner of this. Like, yeah. So that means you're the owner of this. Like, it's not mine. It's like, it's a ridiculous joke, but this is really what Israel has become. And so their guilt is determined. And Hosea just moves on. He specifies their crimes later on, but for the sake of the introduction, it's just about the sign acts. So the guilt is assumed. The meaning of the sign acts between his kids is really the point. Now, a couple of things before we actually read Deuteronomy here. This land is guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord. This is a good opportunity to remind you of a couple of things that are worth keeping in mind. In the ancient Near Eastern view of heaven and earth, it's not that they're separate places. They are connected, they overlap, especially in the holy places, the sacred places, the places set apart. So if you go back to what we talked about in Major Themes, Part 2, the invitation to know Yahweh, the second theme there is creation corrodes because Yahweh is not known. So the land is suffering its penalties because the people of that land are guilty. Creation is falling apart and corroding around you guys. But when the true creator of the land is not worshipped in that land, on that land, and instead credit and worth for life is given to other Elohim, other gods, such as Baal or any of them, the overlapping space, the land itself, is corrupted away from its intended purposes. Putting this to right is part of the problem, and it is part of the redemption that Hosea and really all the other prophets are trying to communicate. So I'm bringing this up as a reminder because they would have understood this naturally. We need the reminders to remember. God's not interested in just getting people off this rock. He's interested in redeeming the rock for its intended purposes. Because of this conceptual overlap between the divine and human realms, it would be too simplistic to say that the land is merely a symbolic representative of the people or vice versa. It is that, but it is more. The fusion of people and place into a single idea through sacred space where the divine is found and worshipped was part of how the religious efforts function to make the divine reality among men. And this is very important because when you get to the New Testament and Jesus saying, tear the temple down, it's irrelevant anymore. I am the sacred space. And then he extends that out to his people at Pentecost, wherever my spirit is. There's sacred space. You are supposed to be sacred space. And any place you go, any evil territory you are invading, you are to transform and turn it into space where God can be found, accessed, and understood. And if we thought more along these terms, we might be more willing to say the bad places where evil has a foothold that I talked about in the sermon last week. Those are the places you need to invade, because you've got to turn them into sacred space. Ultimately, all of earth is to be God's sacred space. This is Revelation's ending here. So into this worldview, Yahweh sets up Eden, the divine realm on earth. Later, he sets up a tabernacle as a new Eden, the place where the human and the divine would now overlap. They would meet, and wherever God would go in the presence of the tabernacle, he could meet with his human family. Eventually, King Solomon establishes the temple as a permanent home for Yahweh, the only divinity to be worshipped in the land of Israel. With the splitting of the kingdom into north and south, Jeroboam established no temple, just the 2 golden calves. And that's now going to be the place where God and man meet, one in the southern border, one near the northern border, so that they didn't go past their borders into Judah to worship Yahweh. It's a corruption of their purpose, and their purpose is corrupting sacred space. Their sacred identity is corrupt. And this is what why they're called Lo Ami. You are not my people. You are corrupt because of what you've done. And you have to stop doing it and start doing uncorrupted things that I told you in my law, so that you can be right again and your land can be renewed. Jesus understands this, and Jesus is working to get that inner corruption done so that the land can ultimately be renewed in the end by his people going everywhere and invading all the evil land and turning it into good, sacred, divine space. All right, we've already mentioned this before. Ahab, Jezebel, they officially set up Baal worship. It just further corrupts it. Jehu overthrows Ahab. He de-established official Baal worship, but it didn't really stop Baal worship except in an official capacity. The golden calves are not gone. They're still around. We don't really even know what purpose they are. So the union of worshiping false gods in Yahweh's land and the corruption that it brings to the land through the people are issues that must be faced. They are issues that must be fixed by Yahweh, who is going to chase down his wayward people through exile and restoration. I mean, he talks about this. Religion and redemption are 2 sides of the same coin. You need your religious worship practices to actually be devoted to Yahweh, to have a redeeming effect. The point of 70 years of exile is because you guys have not, according to the covenant, let the land rest. The land needs its Sabbaths. The land, you're going to be gone for 70 years, because 70 was a number of total completions, 7 times 10. But also, God let their evil go on for all these centuries, so that every 7 years, when they're supposed to let the land rest and not grow anything on it, the land hasn't had that the entire time that they've been in here. So his numbering count says, I'll give you up to 70 Sabbaths unfulfilled before I kick you out of the land and let the land rest from your presence on it. And then I'll start regathering you and redeeming you in all of this. So for redemption to occur communally, the religious problems of worshiping false gods have to be confronted. Through Hosea, Yahweh is going to confront the false worship of gods that is corrupting the land. So it's all symbiotic. It's all coming together here for a purpose and for a reason. And we want to keep these things in our heads as we read and understand the prophets. Questions on that before we go to a couple of just reading passages here?
4 minutes.
We should be good here, because I just want to basically read at this point. So Yahweh leads his people back into worshiping himself, and as he does it, the redemption of the land can and will occur, which makes sense of what Paul is saying in Romans 8, verses 18 through 24. Cosmic redemption of the creation is tied to the Creator's redemption of his sons, of his family. So Paul says, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For creation was subject to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved. So it's like creation is groaning, we're groaning because our final redemption, resurrection is what Paul means here, hasn't occurred yet. So we're living in this in-between, this already not yet state where we were saved, past tense, and this is a correct translation. We were saved, past tense, yet we're still awaiting to be saved, future tense, in the redemption of our bodies, resurrection life. And you know what? Creation cannot get there fast enough. It wants us to be revealed to the world to be the true sons of God, the true children of God. This is the only place in the Bible where sons of God are not referring to divine celestial beings. They're referring to people. Other than the obvious of saying literal sons that come up in a story, but never mind that. So this interrelated use of land and people is fundamentally a part of the language of the covenant in Deuteronomy. So I want to read Deuteronomy here, chapter 4, and we're going to just read a big portion of it. And I've underlined the parts and highlighted the parts that really draw this out. About this, before we read, Huang says the dialogical character of place and people in Hosea, in that the actions of each have consequences for the other, is reminiscent of Deuteronomy's use of the language of inheritance for both land and people. So Deuteronomy 4, starting in verse 5 says, "See, I have taught you decrees and laws as Yahweh my Elohim commanded me, so that you may follow them in the land you are entering to take possession of. Observe them carefully, for this will show your wisdom and understanding to the nations, who will hear about these decrees and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. What other nation is so great as to have their gods near them the way Yahweh our Elohim is near us whenever we pray to him? And what other nation is so great as to have such righteous decrees and laws as this body of laws I am setting before you today?" So this is a very idyllic image that Moses is calling him to. Now comes the warning. "Only be careful and watch yourselves closely, so that you do not forget the things your eyes have seen, or let them fade from your heart as long as you live." Always good advice. "Teach them to your children and their children after them. Remember the day you stood before Yahweh your Elohim at Horeb," which is Sinai, "when he said to me, assemble the people before me to hear my words, so that they may learn to revere me as long as they live in the land, and may teach them to their children. You came near and stood at the foot of the mountain, while it blazed with fire to the very heavens, with black clouds and deep darkness, and the Lord spoke out of the fire." Just a pause here. You realize that what God does in Exodus 19 and 20, coming down on the mountain and speaking verbally out loud to the whole nation, is communally what he does in private with Moses at the burning bush. It's the same thing. He's just now doing it publicly. The mountain itself is like it's catching fire because God's glory is there. The burning bush that was privately between God and Moses goes back, and then the whole public gets to come into God's presence to an extent here, and God does the same thing there. All right, verse 13. "He declared to you his covenant, the 10 commandments, which he commanded you to follow, and wrote them onto tablets. And the Lord directed me at that time to teach you the decrees and laws you are to follow in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to possess. You saw no form of any kind the day Yahweh spoke to you at Horeb out of the fire. Therefore watch yourselves carefully, so that you do not become corrupt and make yourselves an idol. An image of any shape, whether formed of a man or a woman, or like an animal on earth, the birds that fly in the air, like any creature that moves along the ground, or any fish in the waters below." That pretty much covers everything. And when you look up to the sky and you see the sun and the moon and the stars, all the heavenly array, do not be enticed into bowing down to them and worshiping things Yahweh your Elohim has appointed to all the nations under heaven. But as for you, Yahweh took you and brought you out of the iron smelting furnace, that is Egypt, to be his people, the people of his inheritance, as you now are. After you have had children and grandchildren and have lived in the land a long time, and if you then become corrupt and make any kind of idol, doing evil in the eyes of Yahweh your Elohim and arousing his anger, I call the heavens and the earth as witness against you this day, that you will quickly perish from the land you are crossing the Jordan to possess. You will not live there, but will certainly be destroyed. Yahweh will scatter you among the peoples. And I underline this without bolding it because the scattering, Jezreel's name means scattered. So come back to that. He's tapping into the covenant language here. 27, Yahweh will scatter you among the people. Only a few of you will survive among the nations to which Yahweh will drive you. There you will worship man-made gods of wood and stone, which cannot see or hear or eat or smell. But if from there you seek Yahweh your Elohim, you will find him when you seek him with all your heart and with all your soul. This phrase also comes back up in the prophets. I think it's Jeremiah. When you are in distress and all these things have happened to you, then in later days, a prophetic phrase, you will return to Yahweh your Elohim and obey him. For Yahweh your God is a merciful God. He will not abandon or destroy you or forget the covenant with your ancestors, which he confirmed by them on oath. It keeps going here. I would encourage you to read it, but we're out of time. Verse 39, let me just close it off. Acknowledge and take to heart this day that Yahweh is Elohim in heaven above and earth below. There is no other besides him. Keep his decrees and commands, which I'm giving you today, so that you may go well with you and your children after you, and that you may live long in the land Yahweh your Elohim gives you for all time. One of the reasons people don't really care to understand the covenant in there is because it ties it to the land. And most people are, to use the phrase, so heavenly minded they're of no earthly good. And they don't see the point of God redeeming the land. But it is an inherent part of it. When God redeems the sons of God in resurrection life in Romans 8, guess what? He redeems the rest of creation with us. It's always a part of the story. And I want you to start seeing it because it plays out basically, Deuteronomy 4 just summarized everything the prophets are going to go through. If you worship idols, God's going to be mad, and eventually his anger will lead to exile. But in exile, you can come back to him, and he can restore you. And when he does, he can restore everything and keep going and bring the Gentiles in.